Okay, so let us now go back to our discussion on Mulk Anand and the novel Coolie. We discussed in the previous class the significant stature of Mulk Anand as a preeminent Indian English novelist. He is rated, along with R.K. Narayan and Raja Rao, as one of the big three of Indian writing in English, particularly Indian novelists writing in English. They were the ones who gave the Indian English novel a stature beyond the borders, the geographical borders. There had been writers before them. There had been writers who wrote in English, but the kind of recognition that these three writers gained as novelists worthy of consideration, worthy of discussion, as works of art and as from the academic point of view. I think it is that kind of recognition that these three writers gave to Indian writing in English. Each one has his own uniqueness with regard to the attention that they garnered. R.K. Narayan is often considered as the quintessential Indian novelist, who gave through his novels the flavor of authentic India, without any kind of varnish, the varnish of, the exotic presentation or the varnish of an ultra-realistic presentation. It is, India as is seen through the eyes of the people of Malgudi, like Swami and the others, the financial expert, the Bachelor of Arts, and the others. Whereas Raja Rao really fitted into the slot of the Indian writer from whom the rest of the world would have expected, spirituality, discussions on spirituality, Indian spirituality. And that need was probably fulfilled the most by novels like The Serpent and The Rope. But in his own way, he has written other novels like Kantapura, which are on another level. I mean, which are no, a novel which is so different from The Serpent and The Rope. Anyway, it was Mulk Anand who actually gave to the rest of the world an insight into the social reality of India, the political reality of India. So this is his significant contribution to Indian writing in English. A person who captured really well the challenges faced by a nation that was trying to emerge as an independent nation after years of colonial rule. So, among his many novels, we discussed the major works of Mulk Anand, The Untouchable and Coolie, and to a certain extent, Two Leaves and a Bud. These really do convey the socio-political reality of India around the time of independence. So the concerns that Anand, as a member of the Progressive Writers Association, wanted to highlight. You can see all of them really highlighted in these three novels. And let us now take a look at the way things are depicted in the novel Coolie. So to go back to our discussion, I will make the presentation starting with the slide on the Progressive Writers Association, the agenda of the PWA, and how that agenda is carried out in the pages of a novel like Coolie. That is what we will discuss now. Yeah, so we were talking about the manifesto of the Progressive Writers Association, the association that was aware of the many changes that were taking place in the Indian society with independence, imminent. And they felt that it was a duty of Indian writers to reflect these changes. They could not remain immune to the changes. They could not remain apolitical. They had to be engaged with the changes taking place in Indian life and to assist the spirit of progress in the country by introducing scientific rationalism in literature. So what Pandit Nehru as the first Prime Minister dreamt on one level was probably the same kind of dream that the writers of the Progressive Writers Association had for this country. They wanted the writers to undertake to develop an attitude of literary criticism that would discourage the general reactionary and revivalist tendencies on questions like family, religion, sex, war, and society. So they wanted the writers to lift the society from the clutches of superstition, of a blind adherence to tradition, and so on. And they also wanted the writers to combat literary trends reflecting communalism, racial antagonism, and exploitation of man by man. In other words, making use of the pen or their literary works as weapons to fight against these menaces. So they wanted to rescue literature from conservative clutches. And that is precisely what we see in the representative novels of the members of the PWA. Yeah, so they did not deny the glory of Indian tradition, but then they also insisted that we need to take a more critical look at this tradition and not accept it and imbibe it blindly. There must be the spirit of dissent, the spirit of reaction, and we need to interpret and engage with the society. As most of them were fiercely leftist in their thinking. They came under the very powerful influence of the Marxist thinkers like Marx and Engels. And as Marx said, the purpose of philosophy is not to interpret the world, but to change it. And that is what these writers also sought to achieve through their literary works. And that is why they believed that the new literature of India must deal with the social reality of the times that it is set in. Yeah, so the aims and objectives, we had a discussion on all of these. Yeah, so all in all, he can be considered as somebody who engaged with the major problems that the country faced. One was coming out of the clutches of colonization. The other was battling its own internal ghosts, like casteism and class consciousness and so on. So both these novels, Coolie and Untouchable, and even novels like Two Leaves and a Bud, they do precisely that. So they foreground all the dehumanizing situations prevalent in the Indian society of those times. Dehumanizing both as a result of the colonial presence in India and as a result of the tradition-bound casteist thinking in India. So these, he believed, had to be exposed. And that is exactly what he does in the 1936 novel, Coolie, which tells us the story of a 14-year-old orphan named Munu. We have Baka, the untouchable, in the other novel. Here we have an orphan, Munu, who has lost his parents because of severe economic situations. His father had kind of died of a shock when he could not repay the debt that he owed to the landlord, not to the British landlord, but to his own Indian landlord. And then after the father's death, you have the mother who had been working hard to support her son Munu, but ill health caught up with her because of this incessant hard work, and therefore he lost both his parents. Which is why, when the novel opens, we find him in the village of Bilaspur in the Kangra Hills in the north of India, where he lives with his uncle Dayaram and aunt Gujri. Now, as can be expected, these relatives, especially the aunt, is not the best of foster mothers. You have him being ill-treated by the aunt, as is to be expected. But all in all, this phase of Manu's life is one that is the happiest, actually, of his life. When you take stock of what happens to him during the course of the entire novel, what happens to him during the next 1 year, this definitely is an idyllic life. It is pastoral life at its relative best. He of course attends a primary school, but most of his time is spent in grazing the cows and playing with his friends. So the innocence and the childhood that is filled with all kinds of childhood pastimes, that is what you see in Manu's life at this stage, before the reality of poverty and everything else catch up with him. So throughout the novel, you find that even though it is Manu's character that is foregrounded, even though it is Manu's observations on whatever he sees around him that you find in the pages of the book, you cannot but also overlook the fact that at the same time, it is actually the story also of the new emergent democracy, the country that had just become independent and which was trying to come into its own, build itself anew. So, that is how it becomes a kind of a national allegory. The novel can very well be considered as a national allegory, which traces, on the one hand, the life of Manu. To that extent, you may consider it as a Bildungsroman. It is a novel of growth. It is a coming-of-age novel. It is a novel which traces the growth of Manu's character. But at the same time, you can also see it as a national allegory, which traces the growth of the newly independent nation, and a nation which moved from its pastoral past to a more industrialized, mechanized, and a modern society. That is exactly what you have. So the changes that Manu encounters as he shifts from one place to the other, and as he witnesses the gradual change from the pastoral background to a mechanized and an industrialized background, that is exactly the change that the country was also witnessing at that time. So Manu's gaze can definitely be the gaze of the new country, and which is why the novel can be considered as a historical novel too, which looks at history through the eyes of this little boy, or it is a chronicling of the history of the land through the story of the little boy. You can have different kinds of historiography, that is, different ways of writing history. You may have a very classical approach where history is always narrated through the point of view of the rulers, this emperor, then followed by the other emperor, this regime, the regime of this dynasty, followed by the regime of the next dynasty, and so on. Then the colonial government being replaced by the newly elected government, and so on. So everything looked at from the point of view of the regime. That is how history is conventionally written. But by now we are familiar with the way that history is nothing but a construct. And there are ever so many ways of looking at history. And a subaltern view of history is probably totally different from the mainstream way of looking at history. And what you have here is nothing but the subaltern history. History looked at from beneath, through the eyes of a little boy who belongs to the lowest of social classes in India. So we notice the idyllic pastoral background of the first part of the novel, which does not, of course, last too long, because the family of his uncle Dayaram and Aunt Gujri, they have their own challenges to meet, and they decide that they cannot any longer afford to look after Munu. He has to fend for himself, and which is why they decide that he has to shift. As the socio-economic changes affect the village, the family decides that Munu has to move out. He will naturally have to discontinue his schooling, and he would have to go towards towns and cities in search of employment. And that is how Munu ends in a little city called Shamnagar, which is so differently picturized. You move from the hills of Kangra Valley to the city and the landscape of Shamnagar. You really see the changes that was coming around in the that could be encountered in 20th century, in the early years of 20th century India. He gets employed as a servant in the household of a person named Babu Nathuram. So his uncle gets him employment as a servant in the household of Babu Nathuram, who works as I think he's a cashier in the Imperial Bank. The Imperial Bank is, of course, a British establishment. All the officials, the senior officials of the bank are British people. And it is the relationship of the Indian middle class with the colonial masters that is seen depicted. This was a matter of great concern as far as Mulk Anand was concerned. And he makes use of this novel to convey his own opinion about this middle class, Indian middle class, educated but still extremely servile towards their British masters. They consider the British masters as their lords, and they would stoop to any extent to please the British masters. And that is exactly what the kind of person that Babu Nathuram is. He wants to get promoted in his company, in the bank, and for that, he tries to get into the good books of the director of that bank, a person named W.P. England. So the relationship of Babu Nathuram with W.P. England is definitely, it is nothing but, in a microcosmic nutshell, the relationship that India as a country had with the colonial master at that point of time. On the other hand, you have Munu's life. It is nothing but from the frying pan into the fire, as he moves from the harsh treatment that he received at the hands of his aunt in the hills. You now have that place being taken over by the wife of the master. Her name is Bibi Uttam Kumar, who keeps abusing him physically, beating him up for anything and everything. Life is just miserable for Munu. The only ray of light is brought in by the brother of Babu Nathuram. He's a doctor, Dr. Prem Ram, and he's the only one who takes a kindly interest in the life of Munu. It's very much like the kind of life depicted by Chekhov, for example. I don't know if you've read a story called Vanka, written by Anton Chekhov. Mulk Anand would definitely have been influenced by many of the Russian writers, and Chekhov definitely was a writer whom he would have read. And the life that was Vanka's as he became apprenticed to the shoemaker in the city of Moscow, it is exactly that kind of life that is the lot of Munu here in Shamnagar, where he again has to look after the children, the little girl, and her, and he's beaten up for any little error on his part. And things reach kind of climax when there is a tea party that is hosted by Babu Nathuram in honor of WP England. This is, of course, to get, his intention is to get a very good, strong letter of recommendation for promotion in the bank. But, this tea party turns out to be a big flop, and a major role for the party becoming a flop is played by our friend Munu, because as he comes to serve tea, he does not have the practice in carrying tray on a tea on a tray and so on, and the whole thing topples and you have hot tea falling on Mr. WP England, and therefore that is how Munu is held responsible for the lost prospect of Babu Nathuram. Everyone is sure that he's definitely not going to get the letter of recommendation. He's beaten up. In addition to that, when he has to play monkey, he has to entertain the children of the household. Once he has to play like a monkey, and accidentally he happened to, bite the little girl on her cheek, and he knew that that would be the end of his life there, which is why he runs away from there. In between, you have some, even though unintentional, very funny scenes, like he, does potty, or he relieves himself in front of the master's house, and that just shows the frustration in poor Munu and the endless torture that he is subjected to. And anyway, finally he decides that he couldn't bear the abuse any longer, and therefore he just jumps into the train that he has seen passing. Now, the arrival of the train again, in many in Indian work of this time, the train is again a very, very significant symbol. If you have watched a film like Pather Panchali, which again, it can in many ways be compared to the story of Munu. Has anybody watched Pather Panchali? Apu, the role played by Apu there, in many ways like the life of Munu. Of course, he has his parents, he lives with his parents, but the poverty that Apu's family suffers in Pather Panchali is no different from the poverty that is the lot of Munu. And there again, the train, it signals the arrival of modernity. And that it does the same in this novel too. He just boards the train, and as he goes in that, you have a landscape, the description of the landscape, and the kind of changes that Munu witnesses, the kind of things that he had never seen either in the Kangra Hills nor in the city of Shamnagar. He happens to see as the train passes through areas like Rajasthan and the different landscape. In a way, it actually also portrays the changes coming about in various parts of India. So that is how he reaches Daulatpur, the bigger town of Daulatpur, where he, on the train he actually meets a person named Prabhadayal. Yeah, Prabhadayal is, as they strike up a conversation, he realizes that he was also an orphan. And at one point of time, he was a coolie himself. And Prabhadayal takes pity on little Munu, and he gives him a job in his pickle factory. The pickle factory is one that he runs along with a colleague named Ganpat Seth. So Prabhadayal and Ganpat Seth are the co-owners of the pickle factory, and that is where Munu now starts working. But very soon you have Ganpat Seth cheating Prabhadayal, and ultimately the factory falls on bad days. Prabhadayal is soon left bankrupt, and poor Munu is the one who has to suffer the most because of his master's misfortune, and he is left jobless again. It is around that time that he happens to strike up a conversation with a traveling circus, and there was an elephant man in the circus whose friendship actually gave him the opportunity to get into a train that was transporting the circus, which was now moving to Bombay. So along with the animals and the other circus tent equipment, he gets transported, he gets smuggled into the train, and that is how Munu then lands in Bombay. He has heard all kinds of stories about Bombay from the Elephant Man and from others, and he had fantastic, rosy visions of life in the metropolis. India is coming into its own, from the pastoral to the metropolitan future of India in Bombay. However, the first thing that he encounters there is the vision of people like him sleeping on the pavements and on the streets. And therefore, he's actually quite disillusioned that even in this fantasy world that Bombay he thought would be, the coolies remain, the lot of the coolies remain the same. Anyway, there he meets a person named Harihar, yeah, and there he gets employed in a cotton mill. So look at the, from the hills to the British establishment, and then the Indian cottage industries, the pickle factory, and then you come to the mechanized factories, and that is the Sir George White Cotton Mill. Even the name again shows the kind of colonial hangover that hung heavy, and as a result of which all the establishments continue to have British names. So this was known as Sir George White Cotton Mill, and that is where he gets employed. And this is where you find the waves of change coming in through the activities mainly of the trade union. He befriends people like what was that person's name? Ratan. Yeah, Ratan is a person whom Munu now looks up to as a hero. Ratan is a prize wrestler, and he's also very much part of the workers' union. And you have, it's almost as if Mulk Anand himself is speaking through characters like Ratan. And again, there's another fiery leader named Sauda. By the way, I hope you have read the novel. I'm just taking you through the brief summary to tell you, about the significance of the novel. I expect you to read the novel yourself. Please do that because a lot would be unsaid. It would not be said when I'm taking you through the rough outline. In any case, the changing patterns of the trade, the lot of the common people, the workers, is projected through the activities of the workers' union, of which Ratan is a member. And we have the little boy now, Munu, becoming aware of, for the first time becoming self-conscious. These were, these were thoughts that ran through his mind even when he worked in places like Shamnagar and then Daulatpur and so on. But it is in Bombay that he gets to hear the, validation of all his thoughts as he listens to the speeches made by people like Ratan and Sauda. So the injustice of it all, the way the factory workers are made to earn the most meager wages in spite of the fact that they put in long hours of work, and the entire injustice of the system and the atrocities committed by the class divide in the society. These are, really highlighted in this section of the novel. And you have Munu being fascinated by Ratan, and also the other Sauda, who's a member of the Red Flag Union, a kind of militant organization, and the fiery speeches made by Sauda. He's fascinated by the way that Ratan and Sauda stand up to the British managers like Jimmy Thomas. So it's a big change from the kind of relationship that he had seen in Shamnagar, for example, Babu Nathuram and his relationship with J.W. England, and the relationship of Ratan and Sauda and the other workers with British managers like Jimmy Thomas. Definitely, the country is changing. Well, however, because of the kind of labor problems, these factory workers were exhorting everyone to strike work and so on. Naturally, the factory falls on bad days and it is forced to close down. But unfortunately, here comes the next main evil that destroys the Indian society. And what is that? The communal riots. The discussions somehow take a very unfortunate turn, and it becomes a religious conflict or a communal conflict with the Hindus and the Muslims fighting against each other. What began as an argument within the factory soon broke out in the rest of the city, and you have a major communal riot breaking out in the city, and all hell breaks loose there. Munu is stranded in this huge city where he knows no one other than Harihar, his wife, and a few other workers of the factory. And that is how you find him stranded. He does not know where to go, and he's stranded. And in that scuffle, as he loses his way and gets wanders in the city of Bombay, he happens to be hit by a car, and the owner of the car takes pity on him, and she ensures the fact that he is taken to the hospital, given treatment, and then she takes him along with him. And that was the person who was in the car was Mrs. Mainwaring. She's an Anglo-Indian lady, and she takes Munu now to Simla. So it is back to the hills now, from Kangra to Simla, from hill to hill. But by this time, he has completed one whole year of his life and a whole cycle of change. You have the novel now, giving you a lot of insight into the life of Mrs. Mainwaring. This has often been considered as a major drawback of the novel. It's a novel that definitely aims to paint the socio-economic reality. But then at some point of time, Anand probably would have taken some time to write the novel. It would definitely not have been written at a stretch. That is quite evident when you read the novel. And this last section in Simla, where he deserves considerable space to tell us about the life of Mrs. Mainwaring, where she becomes a member of the Anglo-Indian community. And the difficulties that she faces, where she fits into neither of the communities. She's like a hybrid character. The Indians do not see her as belonging to their community, nor does she feel at one with the Indians. What about the British? They definitely do not consider her as one among them. For them, she is an Indian. But then she aspires to be one like them, but then she encounters a lot of problems. So this is again the kind of, Mrs. Mainwaring there becomes a kind of allegory or a symbol, you may say, for India again, the kind of difficulty that the India or the Indian nation probably faced as it tried to position itself, coming out of the 200 years of colonization and rebuilding itself as a new nation. On the one hand, you have people like Mahatma Gandhi, for example, who believe that we need to go back to our roots, our traditional roots, and that it is in the villages that the life of India, the soul of India is to be found in the villages. He kept reiterating. Whereas on the other hand, you have the very Western educated Pandit Nehru, who had power in his hands and who believed that the future of India lay in industrialization. So this kind of, conflict that the new country faced is again something that Anand, as a socially committed and conscious writer, would definitely have pondered over. And that is what he probably expresses through the character of Mrs. Mainwaring. And then a lot, actually, her relationship with men. And again, because of the fact that she cannot fit into either of the communities, either as an Indian or as a Westerner. You find her becoming more or less, promiscuous and entertaining all the men who come into her life. And there are shades of that kind of promiscuity in her relationship with Munu as well. Of course, it is not so clearly highlighted, but the awakening of Munu's sexuality is something that you feel very strongly here, in the way that he is uneasy about the changes that he encounters in himself in the company of Mrs. Mainwaring, and the guilt that he feels, the desire that he feels, all of that. It's a very the adolescence of Munu is very well captured in his relationship with Mrs. Mainwaring, because by this time he's crossed over to his 15th year. From 14 he's now reached 15. But she takes pity on the boy. She looks after him, and she he soon becomes a kind of personal assistant to Mainwaring, and he's the one who then takes her around wherever she wants to go. He becomes a kind of rickshaw driver, a rickshaw puller, in order to take her from one place to the other. However, this life is of a rickshaw driver is something that he is physically mm, struggling to it's a physical struggle for him to work as a rickshaw driver, and very soon you find him contracting TB. It could probably have been a result of the days that he spent in the factories, both the pickle factory and the cotton mill factory, because in both those situations you have a reference to the complaints raised by a few people against the kind of polluting atmosphere created by both the factories, particularly the pickle factory, where you have a lot of thick, dark fumes coming out, and then people in the neighborhood complaining against it and so on. And so the smoke-filled days of India getting industrialized. That is what you have in the story of Munu also. At that point of time, he contracts TB, and then very abruptly, almost in a very shocking way, in the very last line of the novel, as he is in quarantine, like many of us were at this point of time, he is also in quarantine. He's in a quarantine shed, where he is getting cured for his tuberculosis, his consumption. But in the early hours of one unreal white night, he passed away, the tide of his life having reached back to the deeps. And that is the end of Munu's life. He dies at the end. So it's, you have covered a full circle, and you have a novel which, at various levels is, which is significant for various reasons. On the first, of course, it is a story of a character like Munu, and you have the novel taking you through a journey of growing up. The young boy who grows up from his innocent, playful childhood to a serious, responsible, and a very burdensome and aware adulthood. So that is how you have the innocence and the experience gathered in the pages of this novel, for which reason you may consider it as a very significant Bildungsroman. You have a Bildungsroman is very much a part of the novel tradition. Many of the earliest novels written in any language, in the literature of any language, for example, whether it is English or German, the Bildungsroman tradition is part and parcel of the early years of the novel's formation in those languages. And in Indian English writing too, the Bildungsroman of characters like Munu, Baka, and so on, they form a significant chapter of the Indian novel in English. It's a coming-of-age novel, a novel which traces the growth of Munu and his journey from innocence to experience. And you find, the novelist speaking through Munu's consciousness, the very innocent queries that he has at the beginning. There are certain things that he feels are not right, and he verbalizes them. Is this right? And so on. These are questions that he keeps asking. As I told you, the same questions get validated when he hears these questions being raised in the form of those fiery protest speech delivered by the trade union workers. So he observes the changes coming over in the society, the spectacle of the village to the town, to the city, and the kind of changes that come about in the society as these changes come about. From the pastoral, the idyllic pastoral life, where you are not exposed to the evils of greed and selfishness and so on, and which creep in as the society changes. That is also very clearly brought in the novel, and that is why it becomes a very significant novel, coming-of-age novel, not just of the protagonist, but also of the society in which the protagonist's life is set. But all in all, one may say that it's not a very bleak and very world-weary vision that informs the novels. In spite of all the troubles that he faces, It is, a ray of hope and optimism that shines through. Munu never becomes skeptical, too skeptical or too cynical about humanity. He seems to have hope and he seems to have faith in human goodness. I think it is Anand himself who therefore expresses himself through the character of Manu. Never was Anand so cynical. In spite of all the atrocities about which he wanted to write, he always had great faith in humanity and human goodness. And it is to that extent that he encouraged, the promotion of arts and culture and so on. So in Manu's character, you have many of the concerns of Anand as a novelist. All in all, I think the novel can be considered as significant for all these reasons. As I told you, it is definitely a Bildungsroman which traces the growth not just of the protagonist, but of the country too. And that is why it can be considered as a national allegory too. A story that traces the growth of the new country as the country as it emerges from the shadows of colonialism and emerges as a new and young democracy. The challenges that it faces, the problems, the conflicts that erupted in the wake of this birth and growth is what the novel traces. It's also significant for the panorama of characters. Of course, it is a story of Munu, but Munu comes into contact with so many characters, and the wide variety of characters that Anand has drawn, that is again something that takes it to the level of, what the kind of position that a novel like War and Peace, for example, would have had in Russia. That is exactly the kind of role that a novel like Coolie, with its vast landscape, it is set on so many lands. It's not just the hills, it's not just the city, it's not just the town. You have so many, the canvas is indeed very, very wide, and dotting the canvas, you have characters of every hue, some good, some bad, some not so good, some not so bad, men and women and Indians and Westerners. And it's like a huge tapestry which depicts the India of the 1940s and 50s. And that no wonder the novel became much discussed. It created the kind of sensation that a novel by Arundhati Roy, for example, would create when it is published now. It would exactly have been that kind of reaction that a novel like Untouchable or Coolie produced. And it is, the kind of Indianness, the kind of the words, the flavor, the local flavor that he gives. It's not as if, when you read a novel of the earlier generation, it would be written very much like a British person's, language. The language would be very much that of the British masters, because they were writing in imitation of the British masters. But here, at no point would you say that this could be written by an Englishman. Never. From the very Munu, oh Munu, it's exactly the way that an Indian rural family would address a child of the family. So that local flavor, the language, all that is so beautifully brought into Indian writing in English. You may consider it as a picaresque novel. A picaresque novel, like a Bildungsroman, is also one of the earliest forms of novel writing in any language. In English, we are familiar with the earliest novels like Moll Flanders, for example, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe to a certain extent, but Moll Flanders definitely, Tom Jones, Henry Fielding's novels. These are all early novels. And a picaresque, whether it is a Spanish novel, a German novel, in all of these traditions, the picaresque element is an inevitable feature of the early years of novel writing. The loose, episodic novels, where you have adventures one after the other, strung together. The only point of, a kind of synthesis would be the character, a character like Tom Jones or a character like Moll Flanders. But otherwise, it is all very episodic in structure. this novel cannot be considered as episodic, but then it's almost like the the adventures of a Picaro, one who wanders from the Picaret's novel. We are familiar with the tradition of the Picaret's novel in English, right? In English literature, we say that the adventures of the protagonist from one inn to the other, as they travel from one place to the other, and they stay in an inn overnight, and the adventures that they have there, whether it is Don Quixote, Cervantes' Don Quixote, or Tom Jones, any of those novels. Here again, the Picaro is the Munu, the character Munu, who through whose journeys you travel through the path taken by a wanderer. Okay, so to that extent, it's a Picaret's novel too. As I told you at the beginning, it's a historical novel. It is history looked at from the point of view of a child, or the history of the nation being written from the point of view of a young orphan belonging to the so-called lower classes of society. It is not history that dates the various dynasties and the names of the rulers and their accomplishments, but it is history that is observed from beneath, and that is why you may call it a subaltern novel too. Even though it is not written by a subaltern or a Dalit himself, the sentiments here are definitely that the ones that would be highlighted in a Dalit or a subaltern novel. The character, the central character here definitely is a subaltern, and the life of that character presented in the most unvarnished manner, in the most unglamorized manner, in as realistic and as threadbare a manner as possible. A reference to all the dirt and the grime and the struggles of that person's life. There is again nothing, that is polished here. It is all the features of a subaltern novel you may encounter in this work too. And you cannot escape the very strong political stand taken by the novelist here. Here is a committed novelist who believes that the country would prosper and would be saved only when the class divisions are erased, only when the land is rid of its superstitious, tradition-bound past, only when the country moves forward using reason and scientific outlook. So, the political stand is very, very clear. A novelist who is very much concerned about the power relations existing in the society and which make life miserable for the people on the other side of the economic divide. So that is also very significant. And all in all, I think you may consider it as a significant Indian novel. The Indianness of the novel is also something that you can discuss at length in the language, in the landscape, in the milieu, in the issues highlighted, in the characterization, in everything. You have that Indianness that stands out. For which reason, again, this novel is a landmark novel. It's a very, very significant. You cannot trace the history of Indian writing in English without mentioning a novelist like Mulk Anand and novels like Untouchable and Coolie. Okay, so I leave the novel now to you. You may read it, analyze it further, think, reflect over it, and I hope, we could have discussions if you come up with points for discussion. Okay, but please do read the novel. Okay. Shall I wind up now?
Yes, ma'am.